Her evening medication was still sitting on the kitchen counter. That is where investigators found it the morning of February 1st. The 10 o'clock dose. The pills she was supposed to take within minutes of being dropped off at her front door the night before. They had not been touched. Her hearing aids were in the house. Her phone was on the nightstand. Her car was in the garage. Everything that belonged to her daily life was exactly where it should have been, except Nancy Guthrie herself. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She weighs approximately 150 pounds. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, and according to the people who know and love her, she was a woman with a reliable routine, a woman who took her health seriously, someone who did not simply forget her medication, someone who did not walk away on her own. Her pacemaker, a medical device implanted in her chest that monitors and regulates her heartbeat and transmits data wirelessly, sent its last recorded signal at 2:28 inches the morning on February 1st. After that, silence. She has not been seen or heard from since. And before I show you what investigators uncovered next, pay attention to every detail in this case. Because one piece of information that seemed insignificant in the first few hours ends up changing the way you look at this entire disappearance. If you're the kind of person who likes following a case from the beginning and catching the details most people miss, subscribe now. And if something in this story stands out to you as we go, leave it in the comments. Some of the sharpest observations on cases like this come from people watching right alongside us. Now, what happened after Nancy vanished is where this story stops looking like a missing persons case and starts raising questions that still haven't been answered. What followed over the next 6 weeks became one of the largest missing persons investigations this country has seen in years. More than 40,000 tips were submitted to law enforcement. 10,000 hours of surveillance footage were collected and reviewed. The FBI was called in. Customs and Border Protection joined the search. Cadaver dogs worked the surrounding desert terrain. Genetic genealogy experts, the same technique that ultimately identified the Golden State Killer, decades after his crimes were brought to bear on biological evidence recovered from inside Nancy's home. A dedicated task force was assembled and given workspace inside a federal building. A $1 million cash reward was publicly offered by Nancy's daughter, Savannah, for any information leading to her safe return. And yet, as of this week, not one person has been named a suspect. Not one person of interest. Not one arrest. That silence, after all of that effort, after all of those resources, is the question at the center of everything you are about to hear. Now, there is something this investigation has that most missing persons cases never get. The attention of an entire country, the resources of federal agencies, a family publicly fighting for answers, and a mountain of forensic evidence. Those things should be enough. In most cases, they are more than enough. So why hasn't this case moved? This week, the Arizona Republic, a respected regional newspaper that has been covering this case with consistent rigor, may have answered that question. Because it turns out that the man running this investigation has a history that goes back 44 years. A history that, until now, most of the country had never heard. His name is Chris Nanos. He is the sheriff of Pima County, Arizona, the county where Nancy Guthrie lives, and the jurisdiction where her disappearance falls. He is the man ultimately responsible for how this crime scene was processed, how evidence was handled, how information was shared with the public, and how the investigation has been coordinated with federal partners. Before we get into what happened with the Guthrie case specifically, you need to understand who Chris Nanos was before Nancy ever went missing. In 1976, Chris Nanos was 20 years old. He joined the El Paso, Texas Police Department and was assigned to what are called decoy operations, undercover work, where officers pose as targets to draw out drug dealers and street criminals. Over the next 6 years, Nanos accumulated a record of suspensions that, according to police documents reviewed by the Arizona Republic, totaled 37 days. The infractions ranged from showing up late to missing shifts entirely, to off-duty gambling, to insubordination. Those were not isolated incidents. The department's own internal records used the phrase consistent inefficiency to describe his performance pattern. And then there was the use of force incident. Near the end of his time in El Paso, Nanos allegedly kicked a robbery suspect during an arrest with enough force to send that man to the intensive care unit. He received a 15-day suspension for it, the single longest penalty in his record. The department, according to those same documents, was building toward terminating him. Nanos did not wait to be fired. In 1982, he resigned. And here is where the story becomes something more than a personnel file. Somewhere between leaving El Paso and arriving in Arizona to begin a new career, 2 years were added to his service record. His publicly listed resume described his time with the El Paso department as ending in 1984. It ended in 1982. When the Arizona Republic confronted the department about the discrepancy this week, a spokesperson issued a statement calling the date "differences administrative in nature" and not intended to mislead. The statement did not address the claim that he resigned to avoid termination. This is the man who showed up at Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st. This is the man who read that crime scene, the blood confirmed as Nancy's near the entrance, the doorbell camera physically removed from its mount, the medication untouched on the counter, and correctly understood that something violent and deliberate had happened there. And this is the man who then made a series of decisions that forensic experts, retired federal agents, and a former Arizona Supreme Court justice have since described in terms that are difficult to ignore. Reading a crime scene correctly is one skill. Managing an investigation responsibly over weeks and months is an entirely different one. And the space between those two skills is where this case has been living. If you want to follow this story as it develops, now is the time to subscribe and turn on notifications. New information in this case is surfacing consistently. But right now, there is something about what happened in the first 20 hours after Nancy's disappearance, a decision so fundamental that forensic experts called the result unprecedented, that changes how every other detail in this investigation has to be understood. 20 hours. That is how long the crime scene at Nancy Guthrie's home was held before Sheriff Chris Nanos released it back to access. Think about what that actually requires you to accept. A woman in her 80s had been taken from her home by force. Her blood was confirmed at the entrance. Her doorbell camera had been physically removed from its mount, not malfunctioned, not fallen, removed. Her vital medication was untouched. Her pacemaker had stopped transmitting in the early hours of the morning. Every one of those details pointed to a planned, deliberate act carried out by someone who had prepared. And yet, within 20 hours of law enforcement arriving at what should have been treated as the most protected forensic site in the state of Arizona, that scene was released. What followed has been described by forensic death investigator Joe Scott Morgan, a professional who has reviewed hundreds of crime scenes over the course of his career, as a complete breakdown of protocol. In the days after the release, a pool service company called Ambiance Pool Service arrived at the property. The company itself told TMZ that they had never had a client at Nancy's address before. They were escorted into the backyard by one of Nanos's own deputies. A landscaping crew arrived with equipment. Pizza was ordered and delivered to the property. A home health aide came through. Journalists from multiple news outlets approached the front entrance and photographed Nancy's blood, still visible on the ground. Neighbors reported that in the days following, there was no consistent law enforcement presence controlling who came and went. Morgan noted specifically the absence of what investigators call a gatekeeper, one person responsible for logging every individual who enters and exits a crime scene, documenting the time, the purpose, and the contact points. Without that, every person who crossed that threshold deposited biological material. Skin cells, hair, fibers, shoe impressions. Each one layered on top of whatever the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance had left behind. Morgan made a point that is worth sitting with. The DNA evidence this case depends on may have been compromised by the very people who were allowed to walk through it. And then investigators went back, because a camera mounted on the roof of the property had been missed entirely during the initial sweep. The first pass through the most critical crime scene in Arizona had overlooked an entire surveillance camera. Google engineers were subsequently brought in to attempt data recovery from the device. What that camera captured, if anything was recovered, has not been made public. Now, the laboratory decision. This is where a piece of background history stops being simply background. The mixed biological evidence recovered from inside Nancy's home, the sample that may carry the genetic profile of whoever took her, was packaged and shipped to a private forensic laboratory in Florida. Not to the FBI Laboratory Division at Quantico, Virginia. Quantico, for anyone unfamiliar with it, is one of the most advanced forensic processing facilities on Earth. It maintains dedicated rapid response protocols specifically designed for kidnapping cases, because in a kidnapping, processing time is not a procedural preference. It is the margin between finding someone alive and not finding them at all. Nanos told NBC News that processing could take weeks, months, or potentially up to a year. He said he did not want evidence split between two laboratories. He said the Florida facility already had other samples from the case, and that keeping everything together made logistical sense. Former Arizona Supreme Court Justice Andrew Gould responded to that reasoning on Fox News by saying, directly, that the sheriff had made mistakes that impeded the investigation. A former justice of the state's highest court does not select the word impeded casually. That is a legal term chosen with precision by a legal mind. But here is the detail that changes the picture of why that choice may have been made. In 2015, the FBI opened an investigation into the Pima County Sheriff's Department for misuse of civil asset forfeiture funds. Civil asset forfeiture, to explain it plainly, refers to money and property seized from criminal cases that is legally required to be reinvested into law enforcement operations. What federal investigators found was that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been redirected, award dinners, and $20,000 spent constructing a commercial kitchen inside the department building so that a cafe could operate, a cafe reportedly connected to the niece of one of Nanos's top deputies. That deputy, Chief Deputy Chris Radke, was federally indicted in 2016. While still under investigation, Radke took his own life. Nanos was not indicted. He was not charged. But the investigation happened inside his department, under his supervision, on his watch. His public response to that FBI investigation is documented. He went on KGUN, a local Tucson television station, and called the FBI's work garbage. He said he was absolutely upset at the FBI and challenged the Bureau to admit the whole thing was, in his words, total nonsense. Former Chief Deputy Richard Castaneda later told the Daily Mail that Nanos holds what he described as great disdain for the FBI, that a deep grudge has carried forward from that 2015 investigation. And then there were the public statements that did not simply evolve as the investigation progressed, but that directly contradicted each other in ways that go beyond ordinary miscommunication. In early February, with the case still in its first days, Nanos told reporters that everybody remained a suspect. He repeated the word everybody, standard language, designed to keep all avenues open. But by February 16th, he had reversed course entirely. He announced publicly that all members of the Guthrie family, including their spouses, had been cleared. He called the suspicion that had been directed at them online cruel. He called it shameful. While he was saying that on camera, his own detectives were still conducting searches at the property belonging to Nancy's daughter Annie and her husband. Tommaso Cioni, the son-in-law who had driven Nancy home the night she vanished and who has not spoken publicly since. Investigators were still photographing rooms, still removing items. Annie's car sat in an evidence bay for weeks after the family was reportedly cleared. Consider that sequence carefully. A public declaration of clearance, active searches continuing in parallel. Those two things cannot both be accurate descriptions of the same investigation at the same moment. And then there is the matter of the glove. The FBI told NewsNation, through an official source, that a glove had been discovered inside Nancy's residence. On the same day, Nanos appeared on Fox News and stated definitively that no glove was ever found on that property. Not taken from the house. Not found there. Ever. Two institutions, speaking about the same piece of physical evidence, with accounts that cannot be reconciled. Four separate news organizations, ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, and CNN, each reported through their own independent law enforcement sources that the masked figure seen at Nancy's door had appeared there on multiple occasions before the night she was taken. The report cited specific visual evidence, images showing the suspect across what appeared to be more than one visit, with and without equipment. The sheriff's department issued a written statement calling that reporting purely speculative. Rather than holding structured press conferences where every reporter in the room hears the identical information, at the same time Nanos sat with individual outlets separately. Fox News received one version of events. NBC received another. The Daily Mail received a third. The BBC received a fourth. Each conversation produced a slightly different account of where the investigation stood. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent James Gagliano identified this publicly as a fundamental messaging failure, describing information being released through what he called fits and starts, with details walked back and things stated incorrectly. Retired FBI Special Agent Robin Drake offered an assessment that cuts deeper than press conference strategy. He described Nanos as functioning like what he called an unintentional noise black hole, someone who absorbs media attention and generates enough controversy to keep reporters focused on the sheriff himself rather than on the proofs. Evidence. On the suspect. On Nancy. The story becomes about the contradictions. And while the story is about the contradictions, it is not about the DNA sitting in a laboratory in Florida. Drake also raised a structural concern that may explain why the contradictions keep appearing. He suggested that the 98% no-confidence vote, a formal ballot in which 85 out of 86 deputies in the Pima County Sheriff's Department declared they did not trust Nanos to lead them. A vote that happened before this case began and was not a reaction to it, may have created a situation where the detectives actually working the Guthrie investigation are not fully briefing their own sheriff. If the investigators understand that whatever they share with Nanos could appear in a solo interview, phrased incorrectly, timed poorly, or contradicted by something he told a different outlet an hour earlier, they protect the case by limiting what flows upward. Nanos then speaks from incomplete information. The statements come out wrong, and the investigation drowns in noise while the real forensic work happens around the leadership rather than through it. That dynamic matters enormously, because the failures that came next were not communication problems. They were operational decisions with consequences that cannot be undone. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker syncs its data through Bluetooth, the same short-range wireless technology used by phones and wireless headphones. Investigators equipped a helicopter with technology capable of detecting that signal from the air, flying search patterns across the desert surrounding Nancy's neighborhood. If the pacemaker was still transmitting, even faintly, the equipment could narrow its location without a warrant, without a ground team, without alerting anyone. Silent. Precise. That capability was reported publicly in the press before every search pattern had been completed, before the technology had been given its full opportunity to work. Whoever is holding Nancy, or whoever knows what happened to her, learned from the evening news that a helicopter could locate her pacemaker. The signal has not been detected since. The search perimeter established around Nancy's neighborhood was set at 2 miles from her residence. A Ring camera, a common home doorbell camera system belonging to a couple on Caminito Royale, approximately 2.5 miles out, recorded a vehicle at 2:36 inches the morning on February 1st. The timing lines up precisely with the pacemaker's final transmission 8 minutes earlier. That camera sat just outside the established canvas zone. The couple brought the footage forward themselves after watching news coverage. Law enforcement had never contacted them. The perimeter was not extended until nearly 4 weeks had passed. There is one more detail from this investigation that has not received the attention it deserves, and it connects the search failures, the contamination, and the communication problems into something that is harder to dismiss as a series of unrelated mistakes. 34 days into the case, 5 full weeks after Nancy disappeared, FBI agents went door to door in her neighborhood, asking residents whether they had experienced any internet disruption on the night she was taken. A deauthentication device, which is a piece of technology that can selectively knock specific cameras and wireless systems offline without cutting power to the rest of a home's network, had reportedly been identified as a possibility. The couple whose Ring camera went dark on the side of their house facing Nancy's property had not known their footage was missing until they went back and checked themselves. Nobody from law enforcement had told them to look. When they did, they also recalled that their dog had woken them during the night, behaving out of character, ears raised, staring toward Nancy's house at the same time the cameras had failed. That detail, the dog, the cameras, the timing, a possible de-authentication device, a damaged utility box identified within the same radius existed from the first week, all of it available. None of it explored publicly until the middle of the second month. The question that has been building across every one of these details is not a simple one, and it does not have a simple answer. But it is the question that retired FBI Special Agent Steve Moore addressed directly this week on Brian Entin's podcast, and his answer is the piece of this story that no amount of press conferences or reward money has been able to change. There is a statement that Steve Moore made this week that deserves to be heard clearly, because it reframes every detail that came before it. Moore is a retired FBI special agent with decades of investigative experience. He was speaking on Brian Entin's podcast. Entin is a journalist who has been covering the Guthrie case with consistent, detailed reporting since the beginning. And what Moore said about the $1 million reward that Savannah Guthrie publicly offered for information leading to her mother's safe return was this: the reason that reward has not been claimed is straightforward. The only people who know what happened to Nancy Guthrie are the people who did it. They have kept that knowledge entirely to themselves. There is no outside witness sitting on information, weighing whether to come forward. There is no reluctant accomplice calculating the risk. The circle, Moore said, is sealed. Think about what that means for how this case will ultimately be resolved. It means the investigation cannot be broken open by a phone call to a tip line. It cannot be cracked by someone's conscience finally winning out after weeks of silence. The path to answering what happened to Nancy Guthrie runs entirely through the physical evidence, through the DNA sitting in a laboratory in Florida, through the cell tower records that document where every phone in the vicinity of her home was transmitting in the early hours of February 1st. Through genetic genealogy analysis, through the frame-by-frame review of 10,000 hours of surveillance footage. The science has to deliver what human testimony cannot. And that is precisely why every operational failure this investigation has accumulated carries the weight that it does. Consider the two threads that run through everything covered here. The first is the crime scene, released in under 20 hours, accessed by a pool company that had never serviced that address. A landscaping crew, a food delivery, a home health aide, and an uncontrolled stream of visitors, with no single person stationed to log who entered or exited. A roof camera missed entirely on the initial sweep. Biological material deposited by every person who crossed that threshold, now layered over whatever the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance left behind. Forensic death investigator Joe Scott Morgan described it plainly. The DNA this case depends on may have been compromised by the response to the crime itself. The second thread is the laboratory decision. The mixed biological sample recovered from inside Nancy's home, the one that may carry the genetic profile of whoever took her, was sent to a private facility in Florida rather than to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, where dedicated rapid response protocols for kidnapping cases exist specifically because speed in those situations is not administrative preference. It is the difference between a living victim and a recovered one. Nanos told NBC that processing could take up to a year. Former Arizona Supreme Court Justice Andrew Gould used the word impeded on national television. Those two threads, a compromised scene and a delayed DNA process, are not separate problems. They connect directly to the same outcome. The forensic picture that should be sharpest in this investigation has been made harder to read and slower to produce by decisions made in the first days. Now, the question that retired FBI agent Robin Drake raised, whether detectives are fully briefing their own sheriff or whether they are protecting the case by working around him, matters here in a specific, concrete way. Because if the investigators doing the actual forensic work are limiting what flows upward to avoid watching it surface in a contradictory press interview the next morning, then the accountability structure of this investigation has quietly collapsed. The people closest to the evidence are making unilateral decisions about what their leadership knows. and leadership is making public statements from incomplete information. The result is an investigation that appears, from the outside, to be generating noise without generating progress. The 98% no-confidence vote among Pima County deputies was not a reaction to the Guthrie case. It preceded it. 85 out of 86 deputies, the men and women who process crime scenes, execute warrants, and carry investigations forward, formally declared that they did not trust the person giving them orders. That is the institutional environment in which this investigation has been conducted from day one. And yet the detectives on the task force, the 4 investigators, and the supervising sergeant, now operating out of the FBI's Tucson field office, are doing the work. The cell tower analysis is being conducted. The genetic genealogy work is underway. The footage review continues. These are not people who chose their leadership. They are professionals, doing their jobs, inside a structure they did not design. And the science they are working with does not require a functional chain of command to be true. DNA does not care who sent it to which laboratory. Cell tower data does not care whether the sheriff's press conferences were consistent. Genetic genealogy identified the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years of silence, without a single witness coming forward, without a tip line producing the answer. It identified Brian Kohberger in connection with the Idaho student murders within weeks of the crime. It requires one distant relative in a publicly accessible database, one branch on a family tree, one name. When that name surfaces in the Guthrie investigation, and the scientific weight of the evidence says it will, the arrest will follow regardless of what has happened at the press conference podium. But the question that will follow that arrest, and it is a question that a case of this visibility will not allow anyone to avoid, is how much faster it could have come. If the crime scene had been held and processed with the discipline a kidnapping of this nature required, if the DNA sample had been routed to Quantico with its rapid response protocols intact, if the search perimeter had extended to 3 miles rather than 2, covering the camera on Caminito Royale from day 1 instead of week 4, if the pacemaker tracking technology had been allowed to complete its grid before it was reported publicly and its operational value was eliminated, if the door-to-door canvass about internet disruptions had happened in the first week rather than the 5th, each of those windows existed, each of them closed. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was dropped off at her front door on the night of January 31st. Her 10 o'clock medication was on the counter. Her hearing aids were in the house. Her phone was on the nightstand. She was carried out of her home by someone who had prepared, who had removed the doorbell camera, who had apparently studied her routine, and who has, so far, remained unidentified for more than 6 weeks. Her daughter, Savannah, has been publicly fighting for her mother's return from the beginning, recording video messages directed at the person responsible, offering $1 million in cash, standing in front of cameras and asking for her mother to be brought home safely. Annie, Nancy's other daughter, had her car held in an evidence bay for weeks. Her husband, Tommaso Cioni, who drove Nancy home that night, has not spoken publicly since her disappearance. Whatever those family members are carrying privately, in the space between the public statements and the unanswered questions, is something no investigation timeline or press conference can account for. What Nancy Guthrie deserved from the moment her blood was found at that entrance was the full, undivided, professionally disciplined response that a violent abduction demands. She deserved a scene held for as long as the forensics required. She deserved a DNA sample on the fastest possible route to the most capable laboratory available. She deserved a search perimeter drawn wide enough to capture the evidence that existed. She deserved leadership with the institutional trust of the people executing the investigation. What she got was a sheriff who, by his own public admission on the 3rd day of the case, told reporters he was not used to everyone hanging on his every word and holding him accountable for what he said. He was right about that. He had operated for decades without this level of scrutiny. The no-confidence vote did not generate national coverage. The 2015 FBI investigation into his department did not put him on every television screen in America. The El Paso record sat in a filing cabinet for 44 years. Nancy Guthrie changed all of that. And the accountability he was not accustomed to has now arrived, fully and in front of an entire country. Steve Moore said one more thing on that podcast that has stayed with me since I heard it. He addressed whether the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance could do this again. His answer was direct. If the motive was not financial, if something other than ransom was driving what happened that night, then whatever compelled this act will compel it again. The impulse does not disappear because detection was avoided. It becomes reinforced. A person who committed a violent crime against a vulnerable target and experienced no consequence has learned the most dangerous lesson available, that it works. Nanos himself appeared to agree with that assessment. He warned the public on NBC this week not to assume they are safe simply because this happened to the Guthrie family. Agreement and action, however, are two different things. 6 weeks of statements without an arrest is not a case closing in. It is a case waiting for the science to do what the leadership has not. The evidence in that Florida laboratory, on those cell tower servers, in the genetic genealogy databases, is working toward an answer. It will get there. The question this case will leave behind, the one that will be asked long after an arrest is made, is whether Nancy Guthrie deserved a faster path to it. After everything you have heard, I want to know what you think about this. Given the documented decisions made in those first critical days, the scene release, the laboratory choice, the perimeter, the pacemaker disclosure, do you believe the investigation was conducted the way Nancy Guthrie deserved? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and on a case like this, that conversation matters. If you have any information about this case, please call the FBI immediately. The number is 1-800-CALL FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The Puma County Sheriff's tip line is 5203 to 514900. The reward is $100,000. All analysis in this video is based on official law enforcement statements and verified reporting by CBS News, ABC. If you want to be here when this story moves forward, subscribe and turn on notifications. I follow these cases as they develop. Nancy Guthrie has not been found yet, but I will be here to cover every aspect of this case.